The night began like any other. A gentle breeze swept through the small town of Birch Hollow, ruffling the leaves of the tall oak trees that lined the empty streets. The houses stood silent, their windows dark, as though holding their breath in anticipation of something. Something unknown. Lila sat in her small living room, a single lamp casting a warm glow over her face. She had always loved the quiet of late-night hours, when the world seemed to retreat into itself. But tonight felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a weight pressing down that she couldn't shake. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. She tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words blurred before her eyes. Every small noise, the creak of the house settling, the rustle of branches outside made her flinch. Finally, with a sigh, she closed the book and stood, stretching her legs. The unease that had crept over her all night was now impossible to ignore. She walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. The street outside was deserted, as usual. No cars, no movement. Just shadows stretching long under the dim streetlights. But something caught her eye, a figure standing just beyond the pool of light. It was tall and still, almost blending in with the trees. Lila squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure didn't move. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. She told herself it was nothing. Probably just someone out for a late-night walk. But as she watched, the figure seemed to tilt its head slightly, as though watching her in return. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly stepped back from the window, pulling the curtains shut. Her heart pounded in her chest. She was overreacting, she knew that. People walked at night all the time, and this was a quiet, safe neighborhood. But no matter how she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. She sat back down on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, trying to calm herself. After a few moments, she grabbed her phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media in an attempt to distract herself. But her mind kept drifting back to the figure outside. Had it really been watching her? Was it still out there? Before she could stop herself, she opened the curtains just a crack and peered out again. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was still there, closer this time. It stood just at the edge of her yard, still and silent, as though waiting for something. Lila felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was not normal. She grabbed her phone and dialed her friend Sarah's number. "Hey, Sarah, are you awake?" Lila's voice trembled as she spoke. There was a pause before Sarah answered, her voice groggy. "Lila? What's going on?" "It's late. I think someone is outside my house," Lila whispered, her eyes darting toward the window again. The figure hadn't moved, but its presence was suffocating. "Are you sure?" "Maybe it's just someone walking their dog or something," Sarah suggested, though Lila could hear the concern creeping into her tone. "No," Lila whispered urgently. "I don't think so. They've been standing there for a while now. I don't see any dog. And they're not moving." Sarah was silent for a moment before she spoke again. "Lock your doors, Lila. I'm coming over." Lila thanked her and hung up, rushing to make sure all the doors and windows were locked. The house felt too big, too exposed. She could feel her pulse in her throat as she moved through the rooms, double-checking everything. By the time she returned to the living room, Sarah was already pulling into her driveway. Relief flooded through Lila as she saw her friend's car, but the feeling didn't last long. Sarah stepped out, her face pale and tense. She didn't need to speak for Lila to know she had seen the figure too. "He's still there, isn't he?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes flicking nervously to the yard. "Yeah. And I don't like this, Lila. It doesn't feel right." The two women stood side by side at the window, watching. The figure remained in the same spot, eerily still. The longer they stared, the less human it seemed. It was tall, impossibly so, and its limbs were oddly elongated. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and there was something wrong about the way it blended with the shadows, as though it was part of the night itself. "What do we do?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I think we should call the police." Lila hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed 911. She explained the situation as calmly as she could, but Lila could hear the panic in her voice. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol car over right away. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The figure remained unmoving, watching from the edge of the yard. Lila and Sarah didn't take their eyes off it, afraid that if they looked away, it would disappear or worse, move closer. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke the tense silence. A police car pulled up to the house, and 2 officers stepped out. Lila and Sarah rushed to the door to meet them, grateful for their presence. But when they opened the door, the figure was gone. Lila's heart sank as she stared at the empty yard. The officers walked around the property, shining their flashlights into the darkness, but there was no sign of anyone. It was as though the figure had never been there at all. "You're sure someone was out here?" one of the officers asked, his expression skeptical. "Yes," Lila insisted. "We both saw him." The officers exchanged glances, then nodded. "We'll keep an eye on the area tonight. But if you see anything else, don't hesitate to call us." Lila and Sarah watched as the patrol car drove away, the night once again falling silent around them. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fear that had gripped them earlier lingered, but now there was something else, a sense of dread, of unfinished business. "I'm staying with you tonight," Sarah said firmly. "I don't like this, Lila. Something's not right." Lila nodded, too shaken to argue. They sat on the couch together, the TV on low, but neither of them paid attention to it. Every sound outside made them jump, their eyes darting to the windows, expecting to see that figure again. But the night passed without further incident. By morning, the figure seemed like a distant nightmare, something that couldn't possibly have been real. Yet, as they ate breakfast in the quiet of the early morning light, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There had been something about that figure, something otherworldly, something malevolent. And Deep Sarah arrived in record time, skidding to a stop in Lila's driveway. The headlights of her car cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. Lila rushed to let her in, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the locks. Sarah entered, breathless and wide-eyed. "Are you okay? Did it try to get inside?" Lila shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, but it was so close this time. It was at the window, tapping on the glass. I swear it almost broke through." Sarah glanced nervously toward the windows, her jaw clenched. "We need to figure out what this thing is and why it's targeting you." Lila swallowed hard. "Do you think it's supernatural? I mean, it doesn't look like anything human." Sarah didn't answer right away. She pulled her phone from her pocket and began searching for something. After a moment, she looked up. There have been stories about things like this. Shadow figures, spirits, even demons. I didn't want to mention it before, but this might be more than just some creep. Lila felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. What do we do? Call a priest? Burn sage? What if it's too late? Sarah met her gaze, her expression serious. We'll figure it out. But right now, we need to stay safe. We'll make it through the night, and in the morning, we can start looking for answers. The two women sat together in the living room, the tension thick in the air. Every sound made them jump, creaks in the walls, wind against the windows, but there was no sign of the figure returning. Hours passed, and gradually, their adrenaline began to wear off. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, they were both exhausted. "Nothing happened," Lila said quietly, rubbing her tired eyes. "Maybe it's gone." Sarah nodded but didn't look convinced. "Maybe. But we shouldn't let our guard down. Just because it didn't come back tonight doesn't mean it won't." Lila knew she was right. The figure hadn't just appeared for no reason, and it certainly hadn't gone through all this trouble just to leave her alone now. Something was coming, and it was only a matter of time. The next day, they spent hours researching, poring over old folklore, paranormal websites, and even local legends. They didn't know what they were looking for exactly, but they were desperate for any kind of explanation, any hint that someone else had experienced what Lila was going through. Finally, they stumbled upon an old article buried deep in an obscure forum. It told the story of a small village, not far from Birch Hollow, where people had reported sightings of a tall, shadowy figure with no face. The legend claimed that the figure was a harbinger of death, appearing to those who were destined to die soon after. It didn't attack its victims directly, but it would appear night after night, wearing them down until they succumbed to fear, paranoia, or worse. Lila's stomach churned as she read the story. "So, it's a death omen?" Sarah's face was pale. "That's what it sounds like. But that can't be all there is to it. We've got to find a way to stop it before it gets worse." They spent the rest of the day trying to find ways to protect Lila from the figure. Some websites suggested salt, others recommended iron or symbols of protection. They gathered everything they could: salt, candles, crosses, even iron horseshoes, and placed them around the house. It felt ridiculous, but they were willing to try anything. That night, they sat in the living room once again, waiting. The house was filled with the glow of candles and the faint scent of burning sage. The protective items were placed strategically near doors and windows. They had done everything they could to prepare. But when the figure returned, none of it mattered. It was nearly midnight when Lila first heard the familiar tapping. It started softly, like before, but this time it quickly grew louder, more insistent. She froze, her heart racing. Sarah sat up beside her, eyes wide with fear. "It's here," Lila whispered. They both turned toward the window. The figure was there, looming in the darkness, its faceless head pressed against the glass. The tapping grew louder and louder, almost like it was knocking now, demanding to be let in. Sarah grabbed Lila's arm. "Don't look at it. Don't engage with it. We need to stay calm." But it was impossible to ignore. The sound was overwhelming, like it was burrowing into their minds, shaking their nerves. Lila pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The tapping was inside her head now, reverberating through her skull. And then, the glass began to crack. A thin fracture spidered across the window, slowly at first, then spreading faster and faster. Lila's breath caught in her throat. It was going to break through. The protective symbols, the salt, none of it had any effect. The glass shattered. For a moment, everything was silent. The figure stood in the broken window frame, unmoving, its presence filling the room with a suffocating darkness. Lila couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare, paralyzed with fear, as the figure stepped inside. It was taller than she had realized. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling. Its limbs were long and thin, impossibly so, and its movements were slow and deliberate. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but its presence was oppressive, crushing the air from the room. Sarah stood, pulling Lila behind her. "Stay back," she whispered fiercely, though her voice trembled. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them. Then, it raised one long, dark arm and pointed directly at Lila. There was no face, no eyes, yet she could feel its gaze burning into her, cold and empty. Lila gasped, stumbling backward. "What does it want?" she cried, her voice breaking. But Sarah didn't answer. She grabbed one of the iron horseshoes and held it out in front of her like a weapon, though Lila knew it wouldn't do any good. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react at all. It just continued to point, its presence growing heavier, darker. And then, without warning, it vanished. The room was silent again, but the air was thick with dread. Lila and Sarah stood frozen, too afraid to move, too afraid to believe that it was really gone. But Lila knew the truth. It wasn't gone. Not really. The figure had made its mark on her, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted.